I would really like to, before we move on, have a discussion a little bit about how that inclusion paradox that we were talking about and how it relates to how you've just defined culture and how we think we may understand it. Can you give us a little context for what inclusion paradox is and how it might impact the way we approach the work, adjusting our own mindsets?
As you promote facilitate inclusion, there will become a point where inclusion is no longer possible because some of the people who you're including perhaps do not support the inclusion or support some of the ideas, the people who are that you're trying to include. So therefore, in support of the larger idea, the larger theme, there are some people you may exclude because they're not fully bought into this idea of inclusion. So some people will say, for example, well, that's not being inclusive. Well, if it's designed to protect the larger safety of a system in a community, it is. And that's where you may get into more of the equity piece, right? There's a difference between the inclusion and the equity piece. Do I want to include, for example, people have different views? Absolutely. But do I want to have someone in a system, for example, who tells me that not only do they not like LGBTQ people, but LGBTQ people should be subjected to violence and harassment? Well, then that very thing goes against the grain of inclusion. I can't include you, perhaps, for example, in the workplace, if your goal, your aim is to not only question the existence of queer people, but to harm queer people. So that's part of the paradox. Where it can also work in terms of the cultural conversations is that in our desire to include everybody, then the boundary as to what constitutes that culture becomes diluted. So let me give you an example of how this works. So there are a number of people, for example, who are part of the Gen Z. We've seen some studies who really don't want to identify with any type of quote unquote label. So they'll say, yeah, I'm not going to tell you that I'm heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual. I don't agree with the whole LGBTQ acronym. I just love people and I'm creative and I'm open wherever life may take me. Here's where it becomes interesting. Because in terms of honoring voices, in terms of honoring experience, a person may very well say, hey, this is how I feel. I feel different from the norm. I shun labels and these boxes. So therefore, I identify with the queer community, which is what queer means. Queer means going against the grain, going against what society deems to be normal. The challenge is when you're talking to people in the community who have formed this allegiance and this connection with the community based on some very real experiences, based on pain, sometimes trauma, sometimes joy, sometimes really digging into the soil and having carried the weight of what the community is or having studied what the ancestors have taught us. It may seem very disingenuous and it may seem disrespectful for someone who has a tangential relationship with the community to say, well, I'm now part of the community simply because they feel or identify with one of the values, right? So that's where the inclusion paradox comes,